Well, I know I'm a boring dude with the most boring voice ever, but with that being said and established, I know that the last thing you would possibly want to do when you're quarantined inside your homes trying to fend for your life against the coronavirus is listen to my boring voice on free time when you could be doing literally anything else. But regardless, because I love basketball, because I miss basketball, and specifically college basketball, and March Madness was supposed to be done by now, I have decided for the first time ever to make a basketball video sharing how boring I am and how much of a nerd I am for college basketball. And I wanted to challenge myself to compile a list of 10 teams that I feel are the best to never win a title. And that's a vital component because I personally have a very different definition between greatest and best. Greatest to me means that you as a squad have to have hung a banner or got some rings out of it. Even though it's a winner takes all one game type of thing, not a 7-game series like most professional sports, I think that to be considered truly great, in the classic sense of the word, you have to win the national championship. But one of the great things about March Madness and why it's so wildly popular year after year after year, even to non-basketball fans, is because it's unpredictable and because the best team usually doesn't win. Whereas if we had 7-game series, more likelihood that the best team pound for pound is going to win. So I've compiled a list of teams that I thought were the best I've ever seen, the best of all time, that didn't quite get over the hump and win a national championship. So, without further ado, we're going to go ahead and see if we can't tackle this and go one by one with this very poorly edited, very poorly put together video because I don't know how the hell to put together effective videos, so my bad, deal with it. Coming in at number 10, honestly, I'm going to have to go with what I think was maybe the biggest disappointment, the biggest letdown of the great and storied North Carolina franchise, and this was not an easy decision by any means. I'm going to go with the 1997-98 North Carolina Tar Heels, which was the season after legendary coach Dean Smith retired and handed over the reins to his longtime assistant Bill Guthridge. His team was loaded. This team had National Player of the Year Anton Jameson. Yeah, people don't know Anton Jameson was National Player of the Year. This dude was putting up 22 and 11 a game as a junior. Shammond Williams, who not a lot of kids these days will know about, but he was a high-scoring guard. You, of course, had Vince Carter, the biggest name on that team, at least later on. He was no slouch, obviously. But a guy that maybe some younger fans don't really know about, a guy named Ed Cota, sophomore point guard. He broke the ACC assist record that season as a sophomore. Broke it, okay? That is not a small feat. Bobby Hurley played in the ACC, okay, the all-time NCAA assist leader. Okay, so that is a big, big feat. Ed Cota also led the nation in assists per game. He was the first ACC, or I think he was the first NCAA player ever to record 1,000 points, 1,000 assists, and 500 rebounds over a career. He was a hell of a basketball player as well. This team featured 5 guys that eventually went on to play in the NBA. They went to the Final Four. They were number 1 seed. They finished second in the ACC behind Duke, but I think they were better than Duke, and they went further than Duke, and they were more talented. I think if Dean Smith was coaching this team, they'd probably win it all. But with that being said, we all know Dean Smith only won 2 national titles over his long, illustrious career, so maybe I don't really know what I'm talking about. They lost to Rick Majerus' Utah team in the 1998 Final Four. That was a team almost of destiny. They came very close to winning the national championship that year. Rick Majerus was also a great legendary coach. Rest in peace. Did a lot with a lot less than what the Carolina team was working with. Utah also blew out number 1 Arizona, defending champion Arizona that featured Miles Simon, Mike Bibby, Michael Dickerson, and Jason Terry. Blew them out with a triangle and 2 defense earlier in that same tournament. So Utah was no slouches. They beat Carolina in a close game. This was tough because I could put many Carolina teams on this list because Dean Smith teams underachieved a lot. Love Dean Smith, love what he did for the advancement of African Americans in college basketball, his innovations within the game. But I mean, his 84 team with Brad Daugherty and Michael Jordan and Sam Perkins, that's another one. His 86 team, I think, had J.R. Reed on it. He had plenty of them. But I think this team, Bill Guthridge, I think this was the most talented, the most veteran team. the team that probably should have won it all, but ended up falling a little short. So that's why they made this list for me. Number 9, I have to put this team on there. This team was historically significant, not only for their school and their institution, but really in kind of the changing of the guard of how college basketball was played. This is the 2005 or the 2004-2005 Illinois Fighting Illini team. This team was great. Okay, this team finished 37-2. They were, I believe, the third team to win 37 games in a season after the 86 Duke team and the 99 Duke team. I believe that's right. This team went 37-2 on the season. Was damn close to going undefeated. And they were, their team was significant in a lot of ways. A lot of people only know off this team Darren Williams because he was a very good NBA player for a time, though he kind of fell off in later years. He was pretty much dominant. He was one of the best point guards in the NBA for the Utah Jazz. People forget about Luther Head. People forget about D. Brown. All 5 of their starters play the NBA, and all 5 starters on this team averaged double figures. This team was primarily recruited by Bill Self before he went to the University of Kansas, where he still is today. Now, people forget that Bill Self coached the Illinois for 3 years, and they were very, very good back then. Illinois has not been what Illinois has been in the past lately, so people forget how good of a basketball program Illinois was for a long time. But Bill Self took over for Lon Kruger after his run at Tulsa in about 2000. He took over for 3 seasons, recruited his ass off. This team was full of Bill Self recruits, and Bruce Weber was in his second year. Bruce Weber, also an underrated coach, a damn good coach, and they deserved to be in that national championship game. They blew out almost everyone on their schedule. I mean, they had very few close games. They finished the season ranked number 1. They played Wake Forest at home when Wake Forest was ranked number 1 in the country. Wake Forest had Chris Paul on their team. They beat them by 18 points early in the year. Their only loss in the regular season until the national championship game was to Ohio State on the road in the regular season finale. Ohio State was a team they had already beat by 20 points earlier in the year. They lost on a buzzer beater. That was the only blemish on their schedule. They'd won all of their Big Ten tournament games by double digits. And then their only other real challenge was that famous game against Arizona that had Mustafa Shakur and Hassan Adams and Channing Frye. They were down, 15 points or so with a few minutes left. They came back, went to overtime, and won. That's a great game. But that was the only time they were really challenged until the national championship game when they played North Carolina. That featured all those NBA players: Sean May, Marvin Williams, Jawan Williams, Rashad McCants, Raymond Felton. That team was a great, great Carolina team, and it was Roy Williams' time to win a national title. He was kind of falling into that same category his mentor Dean Smith was given a long time about a guy who couldn't win the big one. But that Illinois team, that was even better than, in my opinion, that was better than the '89 Illini team that featured Kendall Gill and Nick the Brick Anderson and Kenny Battle and Lowell Hamilton, all of them. I think this team was better. This team went further. This team was more dominant, even though maybe the Big Ten might have been arguably better in '89 with Iowa and Michigan back then who won the national championship. I think this Illinois team in the modern era, playing 3 guards, starting 3 guards, and really 2 undersized bigs. I mean, Roger Powell and James Augustine was 6'10", but Roger Powell was playing power forward at 6'6". And they're starting Luther Head, Darren Williams, and D. Brown, all 6'3" or less, and they just dominated. It showed what superior guard play could do in the modern era on a basketball floor. So I think this team is significant in a lot of ways, and if they ran into anyone besides that North Carolina team, I think they're cutting nets and bringing home a batter into Champaign. So next up, I got the 1988 Oklahoma Sooners. And yes, that's on the basketball court. For those of you that don't know, this team was unreal. Unreal. I implore you, go to Sports Reference, look them up, and just start scrolling. Read the stats. This team was unbelievable. People do not understand how great this team was because they were upset by Danny and the Miracles in the national championship game. But this team was crazy. They were coached by Billy Tubbs, one of my favorite coaches of all time, just because he was nuts. He didn't care what anyone thought or said, and his teams played super fast, which I've always been a fan of, which you may become accustomed to here in the upcoming videos. But Billy Tubbs had this team playing out of their minds. Oklahoma put up 103 points per game that year. Yes, 103 points per game in a 40-minute game. They're forcing 20-plus turnovers a game in an era where, well, this was the second official season that the three-point line was available in college basketball. They were one of the first teams to really exploit and take advantage of it after Rick Pitino's Providence Friars had rode the three-point shot to the Final Four the previous season. They were taking 20-plus a game, which helped them put up points on the board. They had talent galore. They had Stacey King inside, was putting up 22 and 9. They had Harvey Grant, who played power forward, who put up 21 and 9. So yes, their center and power forward combined for about 43 points and 20 rebounds a game. Unbelievable. Mookie Blaylock led the nation in steals that year. He was unbelievable at that. He was taking away about 4 steals a game. Ricky Grace was taking about 3 steals a game. Harvey Grant at the power forward position was getting about 2 steals a game. Stacey King was getting 3 blocks a game. This team blew out everyone. No one was coming close. They went 35-4 on the year. They won the Big 8. And ironically, in the national championship game, they ran into a Big 8 team that they had already beaten twice that season, albeit in close games. But nonetheless, it was a team that they were fully expecting to beat, because the game before they played a very, very, very good Arizona team that had Sean Elliott and Steve Kerr and beat them easily. They'd been blowing out everybody. They hadn't lost in over a month when they lost in overtime on the road to Missouri. And this Oklahoma team was stacked top to bottom with NBA talent. This was their greatest team in program history. And if they didn't lose to Kansas in that game, where Danny Manning just took over and was the best player on the floor, and in my opinion, in Big 8, Big 12 history that night, you'd be hearing about this Oklahoma team a lot more than you do. So that's why they have such a high standing on my list. Now, this next one is honestly a team that I've never talked too much about, but I've always heard about, and honestly, they're in such high standing with one of the great coaches in the history of the game that I feel obligated almost to include them, and that's the 1974-75 Indiana Hoosiers. Now, this is the team directly preceding the last Division I basketball team to go undefeated, men's basketball team to go undefeated throughout a regular season and win a national championship. This team was almost the same team, minus a couple of seniors, and it's well documented. Bob Knight has said several times that he believed that this team, the 75 team, was superior to the team that went undefeated and won the national championship the next year. I think actually after that national championship game in 76 against Michigan, I think his first quote was, "It should have been 2." Because the 75 team he felt was better. If you look at the stats, they kind of back it up. This team was essentially the same team that won the 1976 title undefeated, but you added 2 more NBA players in John Leskowski and Steve Green, who actually led the team in scoring that season. This team was dominant. They averaged 88 points a game, which was more than the 76 team. They held teams to 66 points a game, which was less than the next year's team. They weren't really challenged. The problem with this team was they went 31-0. They went 18-0 in the Big Ten. They had a historically great coach, still hungry for his first title. Their problem was their best player, in my opinion, Scott May, father of Sean May, who played for the 05 Carolina Tar Heels. Scott May broke his arm during the season. Broke his arm, I believe, against Purdue. I believe he broke it against Purdue. He had to play in the Sweet 16, or I guess it was the Elite 8 back then. He had to play in a cast with a broken arm against Kentucky, a very, very good Kentucky team coached by Joe B. Hall, and they lost 92-90 because their future National Player of the Year was playing in the cast. I will bet you anything that I own that if Scott May did not have a broken arm, Indiana would have beaten my beloved UCLA Bruins in the 75 national championship game because they were the better team, and they would have repeated the next year and gone undefeated again. But this 75 team was better. I agree with Coach Bob Knight. I mean, he was there. He would know. He's one of the greatest coaches of all time. but these guys had, I believe, 8 players that ended up playing in the NBA. 8? That's an astronomically high number. It's a bit unexpected. Now, it's kind of skewed because back then you had more rounds in the draft and it was easier to get to the league and there wasn't as much talent, blah, 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 blah. But bottom line is, this team was better than the team the next year that ran the table, was the last Division I men's team to go undefeated. So they need to be given their merit and their just dues, and I agree with Coach Bob Knight. This is a historically great team. The 1984-85 Georgetown Hoyas, the height of Hoya paranoia crafted by legendary coach John Thompson. For my money, this is the best team. I don't care if they didn't win it all. This is the best team in Georgetown basketball history. This is Patrick Ewing's senior year. He had David Wingate, Bill Martin, Reggie Williams, and Michael Jackson. Yes, his name was Michael Jackson in the mid-'80s. How rough was that on him? Yes. All these guys were veterans of the year before. They had been there. They had done it. They had been on the national championship team. They were coming back to win it all one more time for Patrick Ewing. This team was once again dominant, and they had the intimidation factor. You can watch any one of the countless documentaries or even the 30 for 30 about the Big East. This team personified the Big East. They were rough, they were physical, they pressed all game. You have the ultimate intimidator and shot blocker in the back in Patrick Ewing. This team had experience, they had poise, they had toughness, they had the coach on the sideline who was 6'10", who looked like he could steal locks and mids for them at the power forward spot. Even though they didn't have Michael Graham, kind of the enforcer and the breakout star from the last year's tournament, this team was better. This team was just as good defensively, but was better and more refined offensively with the emergence of Reggie Williams. Because one thing John Thompson teams seemed to struggle with is they didn't have great shooters. And in my opinion, there's no scientific factor, no kind of numbers to back this up. This is why I feel like John Thompson's teams kind of fell off after, the mid-'80s. I think it's because his teams were predicated on protecting the paint, being big and physical and athletic. I don't think they were necessarily great shooters. And with the emergence of the three-point line after the 86-87 season, I think Georgetown kind of fell off. They were still very good, but they weren't as dominant as they were beforehand. But this team was at the height of their powers with the program's greatest player of all time, Patrick Ewing. This team was preseason number 1 for obvious reasons. They never dipped below number 2. They were number 2 for a little while when they lost to St. John's in late January. They dropped a couple in a row to St. John's and Syracuse, but then after that they didn't lose again until April 1st, April Fool's Day, when they lost to Villanova, one of the most famous and most publicized upsets of all time. That was a fluke game. I mean, think about it. Villanova, even though Villanova played Georgetown very close during the year, which I understand, I get that Villanova played them tough, and I believe one game was an overtime game. I know they were very, very close. They were single-digit games. Despite that, Villanova shot 80% from the field in the national championship game. 80%, and won by 2 points. I think it just illustrates how much better Georgetown was. Most teams, you shoot 80% for a game, or a 40-minute game, you're beating the brakes off of whoever you're playing. The fact that Villanova shot 80% in a national championship game on a neutral site against an historically great team like that, a dominant team like that, just illustrates, I think it was just their time. It was just bad luck. It was the perfect storm. I still think this Georgetown team is the best I've ever seen. It's the best in their program's history, and it's probably one that should have been another banner for them. This next one, the 1982-83 Phi Slamma Gemma Houston Cougars. I think this is a pretty self-explanatory one, and it's pretty much expected. This is one of the all-time examples, along with that Georgetown team, of a squad that probably should have won a national championship and somehow managed to come up just short in doing so. And we get to relive it every single March when we see Dirk Wittenberg's last shot being slammed in by Lorenzo Charles, rest in peace. This team, you have a college basketball team that featured two Two players that were considered were included in the list of the 50 greatest NBA players of all time. You have Akeem Olajuwon. This is before he added the H to his name. He had Akeem Olajuwon before he was the Dream. And Clyde the Glide Drexler. Both on that team, and neither of them led them in scoring. Like, think about that for a second. These are two Hall of Fame basketball players for their NBA careers. Neither of them were the leading scorer. That would be another NBA player named Michael Young, who played forward for them. They also had Larry Mr. Mean Mishaw, 6'9" forward, who also played in the NBA. They had Benny Anders off the bench. They had Alvin Franklin, Reed Geddes. This team was stacked. This team won 25 games in a row. This team was number one for a reason. This team popularized the dunk because you had a lot of people, including very prominent figures in the game, including my beloved John Wooden, saying that the dunk was, for some reason, showboating or a bad shot or whatever it was. This team, Guy Lewis, love him to death. Guy Lewis, big proponent for the advancement of African Americans in college basketball. So, I have to respect him for that. I don't think he was a great in-game coach, but he was a good dude, and he was a solid coach, and he achieved great things that Houston hasn't done since. I mean, Kelvin Sampson's doing great things with Houston now, but still not quite to the extent that Guy Lewis is able to achieve there. This is a team that should have won the national championship. Not only were they far and away the best team there, the best team in the country, they beat the number 2 team, the second best team, the Louisville Cardinals. And by the way, this is another team I kind of consider putting on this list, the 82-83 Louisville Cardinals. I think that's Denny Crow's best team. I think that's his best team, and I know that the 1980 team and the 1986 team both won national championships. I think the 83 version of the Louisville Doctors of Dunk Cardinals were the best team he had. And the Houston Cougars ran him off the floor, beat him by double digits. There's no way in hell that Houston, it's been said over and over, so I'm not going to elaborate on it, but there's no way in hell they should have lost to NC State in the national championship game. Another game, just like the Villanova game we just talked about, that was just the perfect storm. It happened. Jim Valvano was a great coach, rest in peace. He had a perfect game plan. Houston underperformed except for Akeem. Clyde Drexler got in foul trouble in the first half, and I don't mean a little bit of foul trouble. The dude had 4 fouls in the first half. How do you let Clyde Drexler, your future first-round draft pick, lottery pick, get 4 fouls in the first half? But I digress. And then we all know what happens. This team was dominant. They went undefeated in the Southwest Conference. They were 31-3. They made the dunk an art form. They helped popularize the college game, and I think they really brought to the forefront the showmanship that we've come to know the game of basketball for generations to come after that. So now we got the heavyweights. These top four, pretty much, I can't argue with them. I think they are clearly a cut above. They are some great teams that didn't quite get over the hump, win a national championship in the single elimination tournament. That's tough to do. I know my pop would probably be upset that I didn't include the 1974 UCLA Bruins that blew a lead several times to the 1974 NC State team, but I feel like these teams were a cut above some of these other ones. So I'm starting with the 1996-97 Kansas Jayhawks, which I still think, and many people will disagree with me on this, I still think this is Roy Williams' pound for pound best team. And that includes his North Carolina teams. I think this was his most dominant, his best performing, most consistent team until, of course, they needed to perform in the Sweet 16 of the 1997 NCAA tournament. Now, to put this into context, first of all, we go to personnel. Rafe LaFrentz. People forget about how good Rafe LaFrentz is. Rafe LaFrentz was far and away their best player in college, and this was a team that featured Paul Pierce. This is a team that featured Jacques Vaughn and Scott Pollard, all NBA players. Jared Haas, who now coaches the Stanford Cardinal. Billy Thomas, NBA player. Ryan Robertson, NBA player. These were all guys that played in the league. And of course, Paul Pierce, a great player, one of the greatest Boston Celtics of all time. He wasn't even the best player on the team. He wasn't the leading scorer or leading rebounder. Rafe LaFrentz was the man. This was a 6'11" center who could shoot threes, who hit free throws at a high rate, rebounded, blocked shots, ran the floor. was pretty much unguardable in college. Then you had Paul Pierce, who was only a sophomore, but was 6'6", could play guard and forward. Multi-talented. You had Scott Pollard, who was averaging almost a double-double at the center position, was a long-tenured pro. Jacques Vaughn. People forget how great Jacques Vaughn was at the point guard position. Actually played the most minutes on the team. This team was absolutely loaded, like most Roy Williams teams are. They played fast. They were second in the nation in scoring. They almost ran the table in the Big 12. Their only loss was to Missouri, which is a rivalry game, which was very tough to win. But going into the tournament, they only had one loss. This team was 32-1 going into the tournament. Playing in the Big 12. You usually hear about records like that from like a small conference team, not from a team playing in one of the toughest leagues in America. So Kansas was the favorite in a tournament that featured Dean Smith's last Carolina team that had Anton Jamison and Vince Carter, pretty much the same team that I featured earlier on this list, 98 season, and Rick Pitino in his last season at University of Kentucky, when he had it really rolling and they were the defending national champions, coming off of what I think was one of probably the top 2 or 3 greatest college basketball teams of all time, his 95-96 Kentucky Wildcats. These were all 1 seeds, and Kansas was the favorite, and it was well-deserved. Their problem was, when they went to the Sweet 16, they played an Arizona team that had underachieved throughout the season and had played half of their season without arguably their best player, Miles Simon. They played a team that was extremely fast, that was faster than them. They played a team of the future. This was a team that kind of showed what a team that had multiple talented, high-scoring guards could do to even a great, talented team like this Kansas team. That Arizona team had Miles Simon, Mike Bibby, Jason Terry, and Michael Dickerson, all NBA guards on that team. They played a lot, and they just, they were on a roll. They put up 85 points on Kansas that night, and they were able to win a very close game. They earned it. Kansas was the better team, but Arizona, it was their night, and it was their tournament. They went on to beat Carolina and Kentucky. So I think they proved their merit, and, in conjunction with what they did the next year. But that doesn't erase the fact this Kansas team probably should have won the national championship. And Roy Williams has said that this was his greatest regret, this team. He felt that he should have at least been able to get them to the Final Four, and he seems to have taken this season very hard, because I think he agrees this might have been his best team that he's ever had in his long career as a legendary head coach. Next up, I got a more recent team, which might come as a somewhat surprise, but really it's not if you think about it. And I'm talking about, of course, about the 2014-2015 Kentucky Wildcats. This team absolutely deserves to be top 3 on this list. Some might even argue even higher, and from a pure talent standpoint, I can't really argue that. I think pound for pound, player for player, this is probably the most top to bottom talented team on this list. I don't think it's close. This team brought Devin Booker off the bench. Okay, think about that for a second. A college basketball team bringing Devin Booker off the bench. And they could absolutely afford to do so because they were that loaded and they performed that way. This was the last major conference, keyword major conference, college basketball men's team that we've seen that had a legitimate shot at finishing a Division I college basketball season undefeated and winning the national championship. They were 2 wins away. They were 2 wins away from finishing 40-0, winning the national championship at the highest level. They played in the SEC, ran the table. Now, that's not to say they dominated everyone. Of course, I mean, any team that's going to play that many freshmen, that many minutes, is going to have their ups and downs. I mean, any team for that matter, even a team that's not just very young like they were. This team, John Calipari, this is why John Calipari doesn't give a lot of credit. A lot of people discredit John Calipari and say the dude can't coach, that he just recruits. I don't know where they were when they probably weren't born when he was turning around the UMass program or making Memphis into a nationally relevant power, but I digress. We're not going to talk about that. People who really know the game know better. They know that John Calipari is a hell of a coach, and the fact that he was able to get this many highly touted All-Americans to buy in and defend, that's the biggest thing, defend. if you look at the numbers, their defensive rating, their defensive efficiency rating, they have the best defensive efficiency rating since Ken Palm started tracking it about 20 years ago. The only team that came close to beating them on defensive rating was the 2019 Texas Tech Red Raiders, who were actually beating them until that last game against Virginia, where Virginia put up 85 on them, and it kind of messed up their stats. But this Kentucky team filled out with primarily freshmen, a team that started 3 players that were 6'10 or taller, had a defensive rating. So I don't know if you know how Ken Palm works. It rates on 100 possessions how much an average team would score on them. It said an average team with 100 possessions against this Kentucky Wildcats team would put up about 84 points per game. That's unbelievable. 84 points in 100 possessions against this Kentucky team. They were dominant. They went undefeated for a reason. I think they got screwed because I think they should have had to play Duke in the Final Four, and if they played Duke in the Final Four, I think they would have beat them pretty easily. But for some reason, they played the number 2 team in the country, the Wisconsin Badgers. For some reason, Duke got a number 1 seed, even though they didn't even win the ACC, and Virginia got a 2 seed, even though they won the ACC. But that's that Duke bias, and I don't really want to entertain any of these Duke fans, that don't even know enough about their program to really argue with me about Duke history. I digress on that point. This team was great. I think they should have won the national championship, and I think they got screwed, and I think Wisconsin got screwed because they had to play Kentucky in this game, and they were very, very tired and worn down and played a much less talented team in Duke the 2 nights later and lost a national championship game. I think the 2014-2015 Kentucky Wildcats with Karl-Anthony Towns, Devin Booker, and Harrison Twins, Trey Lyles, all these NBA players. They had 9 NBA players on their roster, by the way. I think this team rightfully deserves to be top 3 in the greatest teams to have never won the national championship. And that brings us to what I believe, my opinion, the top 2 undisputed best non-title winners in the history of the great college game. And honestly, these could go either way, and I could understand anybody putting my number 2 team at number 1, and I would not be mad at you. I think it's more personal preference, and I'm probably a little biased, to be honest. But the number 2 team I have on my list is still, in my opinion, the best team in the history of that storied program. It's the 1998-1999 Duke Blue Devils. And you might say, how can I say that a team that didn't win it all is the best that Coach K's ever had? Well, for a variety of reasons. If you've never heard of this team, you've never looked at this team, if you're a so-called Duke fan, which means that you're probably in your mid-20s or lower, and you have no idea about anything past, I don't know, beyond 2005 or so, go back and look at the stats, look at the players, and see how great, how dominant this Duke team was. It's kind of unbelievable, because bear in mind, this team played in the ACC when multiple teams were ranked and were making the tournament every year. This is back when Maryland was a top 10 team. They had Stevie Franchise, Juan Dixon, all of them. A team that would a couple years later make a couple Final Fours and win a national championship. This Duke team was historically dominant. They led the nation in scoring at 92 points per game. They held teams to 67. So the average score of their basketball games was 92 to 67. Let that sink in for a second. They played 39 games. The average score was 92 to 67. They were crazy talented and dominant. They were very consistent. They had shooters. They had wing players. They had a great point guard. They had a dominant center. They had guys off the bench. They had everything. And young guys will look at this roster, young bandwagon fans of Duke who supposedly are Duke born and bred and Duke till they die and won't recognize a lot of these names. That just shows a little bit of the youthfulness of a lot of these people. This Duke team is still, in my opinion, the best Duke team ever. I don't think it's really close. I think they're better than the 92 Duke team that had Leitner, Hurley, and Grant Hill. Yeah, I know what I said. This team's better. This team had National Player of the Year as well, Elton Brand, averaging 18 and 10 a game. Had Trajan Langdon, the original J.J. Redick. Yes, averaging 17 a game at the guard spot. This Duke could flat out shoot. William Avery was a sophomore point guard, averaging 15 points a game, 5 assists. Kids don't know who William Avery was. He was nice. This dude was a highly ranked point guard for a reason. He went to the league after this season. They had Duke's first official one-and-done player, Corey Maggette, came off the bench, averaging 11 points and 4 rebounds. He was explosive. He'd come off the bench and immediately get production. If there was a sixth man of the year in the NCAA, Corey Maggette would have won it hands down. They had Chris Carrawell, a veteran, a very good basketball player. They also had sophomore Shane Battier, who would later become National Player of the Year himself, also on this team. I mean, there's not a lot of, like, quote-unquote big names if you don't really study the college game. But this team, just look at the numbers, look at the schedule, it speaks for itself. This team lost, I believe, in the Alaska Shootout in late November to Cincinnati, a team that featured Kenyon Martin, which the next year would be number one almost the entire season until Kenyon Martin got hurt. They lost to Cincinnati by 2 points in the Alaska Shootout. They then win 32 straight games. 32. They went undefeated in the ACC. I don't think any, I could be wrong, I don't think any other team's gone undefeated in the ACC since. Especially in this modern era. No team's gone undefeated. They did, and they had a grand total, including the national championship game, they had a grand total of 5 single-digit games. 5. That includes both of their losses on this season. They were, I believe, the third team to win the second team after the 86 Blue Devils to win 37 games in a year. They probably should have won 38. They were so good. They were so good, so dominant. When the NCAA tournament started, the New York Times published an article calling the March Madness tournament the Duke Invitational. That's how dominant that Duke team was. And they weren't even ranked number one. They got to the national championship game. Their first 4 games, they won by an average of 30 points per game. They beat a very good Michigan State team in the Final Four, which would win the national championship the next season. And in the national championship game, they played a fellow number 1 seed, Connecticut, who technically was the higher seed because they were number 1. But Duke was a 9.5 point favorite over Connecticut in the national championship game. These are 2 number 1 seeds. That is unheard of. If you went to Vegas, Duke was a 9-point favorite over a fellow number 1 seed. This is how dominant Duke was. And of course, Connecticut, great team, great coach. It was their time. They were hungry. They won the game. However, this 99 Duke team is one of those teams where if you gave me an opportunity to have any team play one game against any team for all the money in the world, if I wanted to pick one team from history to play one game to win, this might be the team that I would pick. Either this or the number 1 team on my list. This team is up there. This team was great. I hate Duke with everything in me, but this Duke team might be the best team, pound for pound, I've ever seen in college basketball history. And finally, of course, this brings us to my number 1 team that I believe all-time the best team to not win the national championships. Is my personal all-time favorite basketball team, and that is the 1990-1991 UNLV Runnin' Rebels. Now, like I said, I can understand if people would put the 99 Duke team over this team. I even can kind of understand if you put the 2015 Kentucky team over this team just because of sheer numbers and top to bottom talent, all of that, eras. But this team, it's like their level of dominance we have not seen since this team came out. I think personally they were even more dominant, and at their best they were even more awe-inspiring than the 99 Duke team. This UNLV team, they featured National Player of the Year Larry Johnson, who was putting up 23 points and 11 rebounds a game. You have Stacey Augmon, who was 3-time National Defensive Player of the Year, another lottery pick. You have Anderson Hunt, who was averaging 17 points per game at the shooting guard position. You have Greg Anthony, another first-round draft pick, who was averaging 12 points and 9 assists. You had George Ackles in there, who was a world-class athlete running center for them. You had 2 more future NBA players off the bench with Everett Gray and Elmore Spencer, who was a 7-footer. This team completely demoralized opponents. You really can't understand how dominant they were unless you watch them play. This team, going into the previous season where they won the national championship, won 45 straight games, which is the longest winning streak that we've seen since the great UCLA teams of the late 60s and early 70s when they won 88 games in a row with Bill Walton and company going back into Sidney Wicks and whatnot. This team was that dominant. The 1990 team is famous because they blew out Duke by 30 points in the 1990 national championship game, which is still a record. They put up 103 points on them. This team was better than that team. They returned 4 of the 5 starters, and the one starter they lost, David Butler, their center, I think George Ackles, their center, was better suited for this team. He was a better defender, he's a better shot blocker, he was a better athlete, he was faster. He just wasn't quite the offensive threat. But when you have Larry Johnson, Stacey Augmon, Anderson Hunt, and Greg Anthony putting up double-digit scoring like they were, you don't really need a guy to score a whole bunch. You need a guy to rebound, run the floor, be athletic, and that's exactly what George Ackles did. Plus, they had a future NBA player, first-round draft pick, Elmore Spencer, coming off the bench at 7 feet to replace him at the center position. This team was unbelievably dominant. They had a grand total of 3 single-digit games the entire season, including a very famous matchup with number 2 Arkansas on the road in mid-February, in which they ended up winning by 7 points. Now, this is significant because this Arkansas team I actually considered putting on this list because I've always thought this. I think that 1991 Arkansas team was Nolan Richardson's best team he's ever had. And that includes his 94 national championship team. And that includes his 95 national runner-up team. I think this 91 Arkansas team was better than both of them. They were more talented. They won more games. The stats back it up. They had Todd Day, Lee Mayberry. They had Oliver Miller. They had Isaiah Morris. They had Ron Heary. These are all NBA players. They averaged over 100 points a game. They were clearly the number 2 team in the country. And they got upset by a great Kansas team led by Roy Williams in the 1991 tournament before the Final Four. This team was easily the number 2 team in the country, and if you watch that game, you can watch it on YouTube, UNLV was blowing them out. If you go into the second half, they were up 20 points at one point, and the final score, 112 to 105, makes it seem much closer than it actually was. UNLV was well in control late in the game when Todd Day tried to swing on Larry Johnson and got a technical, and they both got teed up and thrown out the game. UNLV had it easily in hand on the road at a hostile Barnhill Arena. I mean, that's just a testament to how dominant they were. They did this to everybody. They played Michigan State with Steve Smith earlier in that year, and they beat them by 20 points. They played a ranked Princeton team back when Princeton was really good. They meant something. They beat them by 30. They beat a very highly ranked New Mexico State. New Mexico State was ranked top 15 this year, and they beat them twice, both times by double digits. Like, UNLV was not really challenged until the NCAA tournament when they played Georgetown, who featured both Dikembe Mutombo and Alonzo Mourning. Understandably, they struggled a little bit with their size, and they ended up winning by 8 points. They blew out everyone else, and then they played probably the worst possible matchup they could have found in the Final Four. They played a Duke team that they had beat by 30 points the year before in the national championship game. Psychologically, if you're a team that's won 45 straight games, you're the defending national champions, and the last time you met this team, you beat them by 30 points. Psychologically, I mean, you got a bunch of kids. You got teenagers, young men. Like, Jerry Tarkanian told them not to take them lightly, and he was scared to death, but they're kids. You understand their mindset. UNLV did not play well in that game, and people act like Duke was way overmatched. This is a Duke team that had 3 future lottery picks on their team. They had Grant Hill, even though he's a freshman, was probably the most talented player out there, Christian Laettner, and Bobby Hurley. And UNLV was still winning the entire game. And somehow they decided to come up with a famous Duke call toward the end to foul out Greg Anthony for the first time in his college career on a charge that should have been an and one. And Duke was able to pull it out. But Regardless, look into the game. Look at how good that Duke team was, and consider the fact that Larry Johnson and Stacey Augmon, two first-team All-Americans, and Larry Johnson was National Player of the Year. These two combined for 19 points in the game. Combined for 19. Larry Johnson averaged 23 by himself. They combined for 19 points, and Duke was still losing the entire game. Their combined averages, Larry Johnson and Stacey Augmon, was over 40. Anderson Hunt and Greg Anthony had to carry them, and they did that. And then Bobby Hurley played great. Christian Laettner went off. Grant Hill stepped up big time as a true freshman, had a great game on both sides of the floor. They played probably their best game of the season. UNLV played one of their poorest, and it ended up being a 2-point loss. That shows how great and how dominant this UNLV team was. I still think they're the best college basketball team. If you need one game, I'm picking this team probably to beat anyone that's ever been played. They had a great swagger about them. People were intimidated by them. You never knew when the big run was coming from this UNLV team. You just knew it was coming, and it was going to come because of their defense. I think they're probably the best man-to-man pressure defensive team we've ever seen in the history of the college game. They were led by a great coach. They were a national championship team. They should have won 2 in a row. And I think it's the best team I've ever seen, top to bottom, in college basketball history. You know all the cliche things. Subscribe to your boy, help me out a little bit and get the name out. I'm sure there's some disagreements. I'm sure teams I left off the list broke your little heart. Go ahead and leave some hate down there in the comments. I will happily respond and engage with you, or more productively, make suggestions on what videos I should make or what I should elaborate or talk about next. I thank y'all. Appreciate you a lot. Couldn't do it without y'all.